She walked into that land office with her dead uncle's deed in one hand and nothing else in the other. No husband, no money, no name anyone in Red Hollow, Wyoming recognized, and the clerk laughed at her face. Not behind her back. To her face. Evelyn Harper didn't flinch. She set that paper on his desk and said, "Process it." If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, you've already decided to call home, this story is for you. Subscribe, stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. The stagecoach didn't slow when it hit the ruts outside Red Hollow. It lurched, bounced hard enough to knock a grown man sideways, and Evelyn Harper pressed one hand flat against the wooden wall and kept her spine straight. She'd been on the road for 11 days. She wasn't going to let the last quarter mile break her posture. When the coach finally rolled to a stop in front of the general store, the driver climbed down and opened the door without looking at her. He'd stopped making conversation sometime around Kansas. Evelyn stepped out on her own set, her worn leather satchel on the ground, and then reached back inside for the flat-topped wooden tool chest she'd carried all the way from Missouri. It was heavy. She didn't ask for help. The street was busy for a small town. Men moved between buildings. Horses stood tied to posts. Two women in aprons talked quietly near the dry goods window. Every single one of them stopped when they saw her. She was aware of the looking. She'd been aware of it at every stop since she crossed the Wyoming border. A woman traveling alone with a tool chest instead of a hat box tended to attract attention she hadn't asked for and didn't particularly want. "That all you brought?" the driver said. "That's all I need," Evelyn said. He looked at the tool chest, looked at her, and climbed back up onto the coach without another word. The horses moved on. The dust settled around her boots. A man sitting on the bench outside the general store leaned over and spat into the dirt. He was somewhere in his 60s face, like weathered bark, and he looked her over the way men in these towns looked over livestock they weren't planning to buy. "You lost," he said. "No," Evelyn said. "I'm looking for the land office." He pointed without enthusiasm. "Down the street, past the livery. But if you're looking to file paperwork for somebody, you'd be better off waiting outside. Harlan don't like being interrupted." "I'm not filing for somebody," she said. "I'm filing for myself." The man's expression didn't change. That was almost worse than if it had. She found the land office at the end of a short block, a narrow building with peeling paint on the sign and a door that stuck when she pushed it. Inside, a man sat behind a wide desk covered in ledgers and loose papers. He was younger than she'd expected. Maybe 40. Clean-shaven, ink-stained fingers, the kind of small-town authority that lived in the set of his shoulders. "Be with you in a minute," he said without looking up. Evelyn waited. She set her satchel on the floor and kept the tool chest balanced on her hip. The room smelled like paper and mildew, and something burned coffee left too long on a stove she couldn't see. After a full 2 minutes, the man behind the desk looked up. He took in her face, her travel-worn dress, the chest, the absence of anyone beside her. "Can I help you?" he said. The tone carried the very clear message that he doubted it. "Evelyn Harper," she said. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the deed, folded but clean because she'd kept it inside an oilskin wrapper the entire journey. "I'm here to register the Aldred Harper homestead. My uncle passed this past February. The property transfers to me." She set the deed on his desk. He looked at it without touching it. "You're the Harper girl," he said. "From Missouri." "Yes." "You came alone." "I did." He picked up the deed, then finally, and looked it over with the slow deliberateness of someone who wasn't reading so much as stalling. "This is the lands up past the North Ridge, 12 miles out." "I know where it is. It's rough country, Miss Harper. No neighbors close by. The well's been sitting dry for 2 seasons from what I understand. The cabin needs work." He folded the deed back along its crease and set it down in front of her rather than behind his desk. "You might want to think about whether this is something you actually want to take on." "I've thought about it," Evelyn said. She picked the deed back up and set it firmly in front of him again. "Process it, please." He stared at her. Then slowly, like a man doing her an enormous favor, he pulled the deed toward him and reached for his ledger. She heard the laugh before she got back to the door. Low between two men who'd come in behind her while she was standing at the desk. She didn't turn around to see who it came from. She already knew what they found funny. She spent her first night in Red Hollow at the only boarding house in town, a two-story building run by a woman named Mrs. Aldred Fitch, who had the narrow eyes of someone who'd been disappointed by strangers before and intended to keep on expecting it. The room was clean enough. The mattress was thin. Evelyn sat on the edge of it with her uncle's last letter in her hands and read it again, even though she had it memorized. You always were the stubborn one, Evie. The land is yours if you want it. I hope you want it. I think you'll love these mountains if you give them half a chance. They're hard on people who aren't paying attention, but they're fair. That's more than most things. She folded the letter, set it inside the oilskin wrapper beside the deed. Her uncle Aldred had been 63 years old and had lived alone on that 12 acres for 20 years. He'd written her every Christmas, and sometimes in summer, long letters about weather and elk and the particular quality of morning light over the North Ridge. And she had written back, and neither of them had ever been much for saying outright what they meant. But what they meant, she thought, was, you are the one person in this family who I think actually understands why I'm here. He'd been dead 4 months by the time the letter from his attorney reached her. The deed had come a week later. She'd given her landlady in St. Joseph 2 weeks' notice, packed what mattered, left the rest. Her mother had wept. Her older brother had told her she was making a catastrophic mistake. Her sister-in-law had said very carefully that there were other options, that she didn't have to do this, that surely someone could manage the land while she stayed somewhere more suitable. Evelyn had kissed her mother goodbye and caught the first coach west. The homestead was worse than the land clerk had described, which was saying something because he hadn't described it kindly. She borrowed a horse from the livery the next morning, a calm bay mare named Biscuit, according to the boy who saddled her, and rode the 12 miles north on a road that stopped being a road around mile 8 and became a trail instead, and then became something that was mostly just a direction. The cabin was standing. That was the best she could say for it initially. One of the front shutters had come loose and was hanging by a single hinge. The porch boards were soft in the middle. She tested them with her boot before trusting her weight. The roof over the lean-to looked sound from the outside. She'd need to check it from the inside. The fence line running along the east side of the property had 3 sections down, entirely posts, rotted through at the base. The well cover was off, lying in the dirt 6 feet away, and when she leaned over the well shaft and dropped a pebble, it hit ground, not water. All right, she said to no one. She walked the full property line before she went inside. It took an hour. The land was 12 acres of mixed grass and scattered pines sloping upward toward the ridge on the north side, flatter toward the creek that ran along the south boundary. A creek that had water in it, real water, cold and clear, which told her the well problem was likely a casing issue or a depth issue rather than a source issue. That was manageable. The cabin had 2 rooms. The main room held a stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a wooden shelf built into the wall that still had her uncle's coffee tin on it, his tin cup, and a Bible he'd owned since before she was born. The back room had a rope bed, a chest, and a window that faced north. She sat in one of the chairs and put her hands flat on the table and breathed. I'm here, she said. It was, depending on how you looked at it, the best or worst decision she'd ever made. She decided she'd figure out which one later. Right now, she had a fence to fix. She was 3 posts into replacing the east fence line she'd ridden back to town for supplies and gotten them without incident, mostly because she'd said as little as possible and paid cash when she heard a horse. She didn't look up immediately. She was working the post driver, and stopping in the middle of a stroke was how you ended up with a crooked post, and a crooked post was as good as no post at all. She finished the strike, checked the set, and then turned. The horse was a big gray, the kind of animal that looked like it had spent years in rough country and had the muscle to prove it. The man on it was cut from the same cloth. He was maybe 35, tall enough that even mounted, he looked like he was looking down at everything. Dark hair under a brown hat. A beard that wasn't recently trimmed. Shoulders that were wide the way working men's shoulders got wide, not from effort, but from years of it becoming just how they were shaped. I was looking at her the way you looked at something you weren't sure you'd correctly identified. That your property, he said. It is, she said. The Aldred Harper land. Yes. He looked at the fence post she'd just set. At the post driver she was holding. At the line of posts she'd already done. Then back at her. You know what you're doing, he said. It wasn't contemptuous the way the land clerk's tone had been. It wasn't the way the man outside the general store had said it either, the slow assessment, the foregone conclusion. It was an actual question. He wanted to actually know. I wouldn't have come if I didn't, she said. Something shifted in his expression. She couldn't have said exactly what. He sat with it for a moment, then touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat. Caleb Thornton, he said. I run the spread about 3 miles east of your North Ridge. Evelyn Harper. I know, he said. Word travels. I imagine it does. He looked at the fence line again. You've got the posts at good depth. Ground's rocky past the 40-yard mark, though. You'll want to pre-drill before you try to drive. She followed his gaze down the property line. I noticed the resistance change. I was going to switch to the auger. A pause. You brought an auger. I brought a full set. He looked at her again in that same careful, assessing way. Then he said, all right, in a tone that wasn't quite approval, but wasn't far from it either, swung down from the gray and tied the horse to the existing fence post at the corner. I've got 2 hours, he said. I'll work the south end while you do the north. She opened her mouth and closed it again. I didn't ask for help. No, he agreed. He went to her supply pile and picked up the second post driver without asking. But you're a week of work away from anything that'll hold a steer, and the Briggs cattle have a habit of testing their neighbors' fences. You want to be solid before they find the gaps. She watched him walk to the south end of the fence line. He didn't look back to see if she was following. She went back to her post. He worked the way she did, no wasted motion, no conversation for the sake of it. When they met in the middle an hour and 40 minutes later, they'd covered the entire east run. He checked 2 of her posts by putting his shoulder against them and pushing. They didn't move. Good depth, he said. I told you, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. In the neighborhood of one. He untied his horse. She waited for what came next, for the questions, for the advice she hadn't asked for the particular kind of well-meaning condescension that men in these towns had a gift for offering women who were on their own. The well cover's off, he said instead. I know. I need to look at the casing. Creek's clean, he said. If the casing's compromised and you need to haul water until it's fixed, the creek's safe enough to drink. I tested it this morning, she said. He nodded, settled into his saddle. Briggs will come to you, he said. He'll make an offer for the land. He's made offers for every piece of property that's changed hands in the last 8 years in this valley. What kind of man is he? The kind who thinks that because he's been here longer than everybody else, the rules are his to write. He picked up his reins. Don't sell. I wasn't planning to, she said. He looked at her one more time. Something in it that was difficult to read, not warmth exactly, but something in that direction. Like a man who had decided something about her that he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. Harper, he said. Thornton, she said. He rode north toward the ridge. She watched him go for a moment, then turned back to the fence. Walter Briggs came on her 3rd day. She heard the horses before she saw them, 3 riders, which was more than a man brought for a social call, and fewer than he brought for a fight. She was on the roof of the lean-to checking the ridge beam, and she stayed up there when the riders came into the yard below her. Briggs was in his mid-60s, built the way prosperous men got built, when they'd done their hard work early and spent the last 20 years giving orders instead. He had a good horse, good boots, a hat that cost more than her father had made in a month. The 2 men with him stayed back. Miss Harper, he called up to her. Mr. Briggs, she said. She finished tapping the ridge beam, checked her work, and climbed down the way she'd gone up, steady, careful, without rushing. She got to the ground and turned to face him without brushing the dust off her dress first. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had been working since sunrise and didn't consider that a problem. "Heard you came in on the Tuesday coach," he said. "That's right. All by yourself." "Also right." He looked around the property. His gaze moved over the new fence posts on the east line, the porch repair. She'd done the afternoon before the lumber stacked against the side of the cabin where she was preparing to shore up the north wall. "You're planning to work this land yourself," he said. "That's what owners do," she said. "Miss Harper." He adjusted himself in the saddle in the way men did when they were about to say something they'd decided was reasonable in advance. "I've been in this valley for 30 years. I've seen 15, maybe 20 people come out here with plans just like yours. Half of them were gone before the first snow. The other half were gone by the second." "I'll make a note of that," she said. "This isn't St. Louis or Kansas City. Winter up near that ridge will kill you if you're not prepared. The summers'll wear you down before you get there." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. "I am prepared to offer you fair market value for the property, plus a traveling allowance to get you back to Missouri. More than fair, actually. You'd leave here ahead of where you came in." He held the paper out. She didn't take it. "I came here to work this land," she said, "not to sell it." "Miss Harper." "Mr. Briggs," she said. "I've been polite because you came on my property, and I was raised to be polite to guests. But I'm going to say this once, and I'd like you to hear it. This land belonged to my family. It belongs to me now. I'm not leaving it, and I'm not selling it, and if you come back with the same offer, I'll give you the same answer." She looked at him steadily. "I'd appreciate it if you saved us both the time." The two men behind him shifted. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. His expression was the careful blankness of a man recalculating. "You're sure about that?" he said. "I am," she said. He folded the paper and put it back in his pocket. "All right then," he said, and his tone had gone smooth in a way that was somehow less comfortable than his earlier directness. "I respect a person who knows their mind." He touched his hat and rode out. She watched them go. Then she turned back to the roof of the lean-to and climbed back up. She found the water that Friday. She'd spent 2 days studying the well casing, found the crack, patched it with what she had, and then on a hunch from something her uncle had written years ago about how the ridge runoff moved, she dug a test hole 12 feet north of the original well site. Water at 9 feet. She sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd found and said under her breath, words her mother would not have approved of. Then she laughed. It was the first time she'd laughed since she left Missouri. It surprised her. She sat in the dirt beside a hand-dug hole in a Wyoming field in the middle of a July afternoon with sweat in her hair and clay on her hands, and she laughed until her eyes watered, because she had found water, because it was there, because her uncle had been right, and she had been right to trust him. She was still grinning when she heard the horse. Thornton came around the south side of the cabin and pulled up when he saw her. He took in the open ground, the shovel, the hole, the water glinting at the bottom of it. "You found a new source," he said. "My uncle wrote about the ridge runoff. I thought the aquifer might run further north than the original well." He swung down and crouched at the edge of the hole looking in. 12 inches of standing water already. "I've only been digging 3 hours. He stood and looked at her. She was still grinning. She couldn't quite stop. "Good find," he said. "It's a very good find," she agreed. "You're pleased with yourself?" "Enormously." His mouth moved again. This time it went further than the neighborhood of a smile. It was an actual one, brief as a flash of light gone almost before she could be certain she'd seen it. "You should be," he said. He picked up her shovel and began to widen the hole without asking. She picked up her spare and joined him. They dug in silence for half an hour. It was the most comfortable she'd felt since she arrived. That evening he stayed for coffee. It wasn't planned. She'd put the pot on to reward herself after the digging, and he was still there tying up some loose edge of the hole's framing, and she said without thinking about it much, "There's coffee if you want some." And he said, "All right," and that was that. They sat on the porch because the cabin was still too close to the smell of fresh patched plaster. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "On your spread." 7 years, he said. alone. He held his cup in both hands and looked out toward the ridge. Mostly, she let that some words had weight in them that you didn't push on. The winters, she said eventually. What do I need to know? He told her. He talked for a long time longer she suspected than he usually talked. He told her about the way the temperature dropped in September earlier than you expected, about the passes that closed in October, about keeping stock through a hard winter and what you needed in supplies to manage it. He was specific and practical, and he didn't soften it. She asked questions, real ones, not the kind that were really disguised requests for reassurance. He answered them the same way she asked, directly, completely, without the editorial commentary about whether she should or shouldn't be here. At some point, the sun had gone down. The sky over the ridge was the color of a bruise fading to purple. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He thought about it. Someone who'd be gone by August. "It's barely July," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm revising." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the ridge, not her. "What are you revising it to?" she said. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the porch rail, turned it once in his hands, set it back down. "Not sure yet," he said. The trouble started the following week. She'd ridden into town for feed the second supply run, and she was loading the bags onto the pack horse outside the general store when she heard her name come through the open window of the barber shop next door. "Harper woman's going to run that land into the ground by October. Place was already half gone when Aldred died." A different voice. "Thornton was out there 2 days in a row last week. Saw him ride past my place. Thornton's always been odd. Probably feels sorry for her." Laughter. Low, easy laughter. She kept loading the bags. Her hands were steady. She'd learned early from her father, from years of being the only woman in rooms full of men who ran the equipment shop back home, that the most powerful thing you could do when you were being discussed, like you weren't present, was to be visibly unaffected. But she heard every word. She was tying the last knot when the door of the barber shop opened and a man came out. Somewhere in his 40s, thick through the chest, the kind of man who was used to taking up more space than he strictly needed. He stopped when he saw her. "Miss Harper," he said. He didn't look embarrassed. That told her he knew she'd heard. "Mr. she said. "Del Garrow," he said. "I run the freight operation on the South Road." He looked at the loaded pack horse with an expression that was trying to be friendly and landing somewhere south of it. "You sure you don't want someone to help you with that?" "I've got it," she said. "It's a lot for one person." "I've got it," she said again, clearly, without heat. He watched her check the knot. "You planning to stick out the summer?" "I'm planning to stick out everything," she said. She mounted up and rode south out of town without looking back. She didn't give them the satisfaction of watching her go. Caleb came by the following morning with a length of pipe she hadn't asked for. "For the new well," he said. "You'll want to case it before you put the cover on. The soil's got a lot of clay this far from the creek. Without casing, the walls'll collapse inward by fall." "How much?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Neighbor thing," he said. "I don't take charity," she said. "It's not charity," he said. 2 summers ago, I had a fence line collapse in the middle of calving season. Your uncle spent 3 days helping me rebuild it. He didn't charge me." He set the pipe down beside the well frame. "Consider it a debt." She looked at the pipe, looked at him. "All right," she said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "I brought you an extra job. You still have to dig the casing channel." She picked up her shovel. "Then let's get started." It was Mrs. Holt who told her about Briggs. Mrs. Holt was the woman who ran the dry goods counter at the general store, who had been one of the few people in Red Hollow to speak to Evelyn without a particular angle behind it. She was 60 or so, iron-haired, with the directness of a woman who had seen too much to bother being indirect. She came to the homestead on a Wednesday morning, drove herself out in a small buggy, tied the horse to the new fence post, and said, "I brought preserves because I needed an excuse to come and tell you something without it getting back." Evelyn made coffee, and they sat at the table, and Mrs. Holt set a jar of blackberry preserves between them and got to it. "Walter Briggs has been talking," she said. "Since you turned him down, he's been going around telling people your land isn't viable, saying the water's bad, the soil's wrong for anything but scrub grass. He told the feed merchant you were behind on payment, which isn't true. I know because Harold is my brother-in-law, and he told me himself you paid cash." Evelyn held her cup and said nothing. "He's also been talking to the bank," Mrs. Holt said, "about whether there are liens against the property that nobody's found yet." "There aren't," Evelyn said. "My uncle's attorney cleared the title completely. I know that and you know that. But if Briggs plants enough doubt, and if he can get a bank examiner out here to poke around, it creates delay. It creates the impression of a problem even where there isn't one. That's what he does." She looked at Evelyn levelly. "He's done it before, twice. Both times the person sold and left before it got sorted out." "I'm not going to sell," Evelyn said. "I didn't think you would," Mrs. Holt said. "That's why I drove 12 miles to tell you to watch your back." Evelyn set her cup down. "What would you do if you were in my position?" Mrs. Holt thought about it seriously, the way she asked things seriously. "I would find out exactly what he has on the property and what he doesn't," she said. "And I would make sure I had someone in my corner who the town already trusts, someone whose word carries weight." "Thornton," Evelyn said. Mrs. Holt's expression said nothing one way or another. "He's been here 7 years. He doesn't talk much, but when he does, people listen. He's never been in anyone's pocket." She picked up her preserves jar and stood. "I'll see myself out. You've got work to do." After she was gone, Evelyn sat at the table for a while. Then she got up, went to the writing kit she'd brought from Missouri, and wrote 2 letters, one to her uncle's attorney, asking for a complete accounting of the title search, and one to the county land registrar, requesting copies of all recorded interests in the surrounding properties for the past 10 years. She sealed them, put them in her satchel to post next trip to town, and went back to work. She rode to Caleb's spread 2 days later for the first time. It was a longer ride than she'd expected, 3 miles as he'd said, but rough miles up over the near ridge and down through a draw before the land opened out into a proper valley with good grass and a spring-fed stock pond. His cabin was larger than hers, solidly built with the look of something that had been added to and improved over years, rather than thrown up at once. Howe was in the corral when she arrived, working a young horse that clearly had opinions. He didn't stop when she rode up, but he acknowledged her with a look. She tied her horse and leaned on the fence rail and watched. He was good with the animal patient, without being soft firm, without being harsh. He moved around the horse the way he moved around everything, like he knew exactly where he was and where everything else was too, and wasn't wasting effort on either speed or display. When the young horse settled, he came to the fence. "Briggs," she said. "What's he done?" She told him. All of it. Mrs. Holt's visit, the talk at the bank, the campaign to make her land look unworkable before she'd had a season to prove otherwise. Caleb listened with his arms on the fence rail and his eyes on a point somewhere past her shoulder. When she finished, he said, "He'll push until you push back, or he wins. There's no other outcome with him." "What does pushing back look like?" "Having your paperwork airtight. Having the town see you working and not failing." He paused. "Having people know you're not alone out here." "Is that what this is?" she said. "You being out there 2 days running." He looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. "I was there because the work needed doing and you were doing it right." "That's not an answer to my question." He held her gaze. "No," he said. "It's not the only reason." The young horse moved to the far end of the corral and stood there watching them, not quite sure what to make of either of them. Evelyn knew the feeling. "I need you to be honest with me," she said, "about whether you think I can do this. Not what you'd say to be kind. What you actually think." He didn't answer immediately. He took his time, the way she was beginning to understand he took everything. Not stalling, just actually considering before he spoke. "I think you're the most capable person who's come through this valley in 7 years, he said. "And I think Briggs is going to make your life very difficult before this is over, and I think you're going to outlast him. But it's going to be hard. I won't tell you different." She breathed. "All right," she said. "That's what I needed to hear." "I figured," he said. She stayed for an hour. She hadn't planned to, but they ended up looking at his water management on the east side of the property, which had a similar clay problem to hers, and comparing approaches, and when she finally noticed the light changing, she realized they'd been talking shop for the better part of the afternoon, and she felt for the first time since she'd arrived in Wyoming, something that she could only describe as being at ease. She mounted up to go. He walked to the gate of the corral. "Harper," he said. "Thornton." "The offer stands," he said. "2 hours when I've got them. And when you don't." He looked at her once more with that reading her quality she was becoming familiar with. "I'll find them," he said. She rode back over the ridge in the long evening light with her uncle's words running through her head. "They're hard on people who aren't paying attention, but they're fair. That's more than most things." She thought he was right. She thought she was beginning to understand exactly what he meant. The letters came back faster than she expected. Her uncle's attorney wrote from Kansas City in a careful, measured hand that told her everything she needed to know about how seriously he took the situation. There were no liens. There were no encumbrances. The title was clean as a whistle, had been surveyed and recorded in 1871, and had passed to her without complication. He enclosed a certified copy of the full title search and told her to keep it somewhere dry. The county land registrar's response was less tidy and considerably more interesting. It came in a thick envelope, handwritten index on the first-page copies of recorded interests behind it. Evelyn sat at her uncle's table on a Thursday morning with the papers spread out and a second cup of coffee going cold beside her, and she went through every page. Walter Briggs had filed recorded interests, preliminary purchase offers, right-of-way claims, grazing access requests against 11 separate properties in the valley over the past decade. 7 of those properties had subsequently sold. 3 of the 7 had sold to Briggs directly. The other 4 had sold to buyers who, when she traced the names forward through the records, turned out to be connected to Briggs through business partnerships she had to read the footnotes to find. 1 property had not sold. 1 owner had held on. She turned back to the index and found the name. Thornton, CA. 7 years of recorded resistance. 3 separate Briggs filings, all rejected, all still sitting open in the county record, because Briggs had never formally withdrawn them. She sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. He hadn't told her. He'd told her Briggs made offers. He hadn't told her it had happened to him too, that the man had been working at his land with the same machinery he was now turning toward hers. He'd given her the warning without giving her the weight of his own history in it. She folded the papers back into their envelope, finished her cold coffee, and rode north over the ridge. How was splitting wood when she arrived. Not in the corral this time, around the side of the cabin, a full cord's worth stacked already, and another in progress. He looked up when he heard her horse. "You've got 3 open Briggs filings against your property," she said, before she was fully dismounted. He set the axe down against the chopping block. "Yes." "You didn't tell me." "No." She tied her horse, turned to face him. "Why?" He looked at her with the particular steadiness of a man who had decided his answer before she arrived, because he'd known this was coming. "Because I didn't want you making decisions about your situation based on mine. What happened with my land is different. What he wants from you is different." "Is it?" she said. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like he's been running the same operation on every piece of property he wants, and yours is still standing, and I'd like to know how." He picked the axe back up. Not to work, just to have something to do with his hands, she thought. "Patience," he said, "and not giving him anything to use." "What did he try to use against you?" A pause. He set the axe back down. "My wife," he said. The word sat between them like something physical. "She died," he said. "3rd winter. There was talk afterward, about whether the circumstances were, whether it was my fault. It wasn't. But talk doesn't need to be true to work." He looked at the woodpile. "Briggs brought it up in a public meeting. Said the county should take a harder look at whether I was fit to hold land. Said a man who couldn't keep his family safe probably couldn't manage a working spread." He said it flatly, the way you said something you'd made your peace with, because the alternative was carrying it constantly. About 30 people heard it. Evelyn said nothing. I didn't respond, he said. Not in the meeting. I went home. I worked the season. I had a better yield than any of his operations that year. The next year too. I let the land speak. He finally looked at her directly. The filings are still open because he left the door cracked in case he found something else. He hasn't found anything, so he doesn't push, but he leaves it there. He did the same to me, she said. He's telling people the land isn't viable, talking to the bank about possible liens, planting questions. I know, Caleb said. Mrs. Holt talks to more people than she realizes. Then you know what he's doing. Yes. And you still didn't tell me about your filings. He held her gaze. I told you it was going to be hard. I didn't tell you everything hard that had happened to me. Those are different things. She breathed in through her nose. Out. The way she did when she needed to think without her temper running ahead of her. Fair, she said finally. That's fair. He picked the axe up again. This time he used it one clean split, two halves falling apart. The bank talk won't go anywhere, he said. Your title's clean. I know that because I looked it up when you arrived. She stared at him. You looked up my title. I wanted to know if you had problems coming that you didn't know about yet. He didn't sound apologetic about it. You didn't. The land is yours clean and clear. Briggs knows it. What he's doing now is noise. He wants you rattled. I'm not rattled, she said. I know, he said. That's what's worrying him. She watched him split another log. The motion was economical certain. A man who had been doing this exact thing for so many years, it had stopped requiring thought. Your wife, she said carefully. I'm sorry. He split another log. Her name was Ruth, he said. She was from Ohio. She wanted to make a life out here. A beat. She was braver than I was in most things. She would have liked you. Evelyn didn't say anything to that. She didn't think there was anything to say. She picked up the spare axe leaning against the cabin wall. Show me where you want the second row, she said. He looked at her, looked at the axe, pointed. They worked the rest of the morning without talking much, which turned out to be exactly right. The split wood stacked itself into something solid. So did something else, though neither of them named it. The first crisis hit on a Monday, and it hit fast. She was at the new well, fitting the casing pipe, when she heard the cattle. She heard them. She understood what she was hearing. A distant sound that was wrong, somehow too close, too many moving in a direction. Cattle didn't naturally move unless something was pushing them. She straightened up and listened. Then she ran to the east fence line. The new posts were standing. But the section at the far south corner, the section she hadn't gotten to yet, the original posts she'd meant to replace after the casing was done, had a gap in it. A wide one. Wide enough for a dozen head of cattle to have come through, and the marks in the dirt told her they had. Briggs's brand. She recognized it from the filings, a doubled B registered mark. His cattle on her land, and by the churn in the dirt near the creek, they'd been drinking her water. She stood at the gap in the fence and looked at the damage and thought carefully. She didn't ride to Briggs. That was what he wanted her coming to his door, emotional, accusatory, giving him something to respond to on his own ground. She rode to town, and she found the county sheriff's office, and she filed a report, clear and factual, date and time and brand and location, and she asked for a formal notice to be served on Briggs that his cattle had been found on her land, and she expected them removed and the boundary respected. The deputy behind the desk looked at her with mild surprise, like he'd expected something different. You want to press charges for trespass, he said. I want a formal record, she said. Today, before the cattle move again. He wrote it up. She went back to the homestead, fixed the south corner before dark, and stayed up past midnight to do it, because she was not going to go to sleep with an open fence line. Caleb showed up at dawn. I heard, he said. Word travels, she said. Yes. He looked at the new south corner posts. Solid, set right. You filed with the sheriff. I did. That was the right move. He said it like it surprised him slightly. Not in a condescending way. In the way of a man who had in his own situation 7 years ago not done the right move immediately and had paid for it. Briggs will be at his lawyer's office by now. Good, she said. Let him spend the money. Caleb looked at her for a moment. You slept at all. Some. You need to eat. I know how to feed myself, Thornton. I know you do, he said. I brought biscuits because I made too many, not because I think you can't. She took the biscuits. They were wrapped in a cloth and still warm. She ate one standing at the fence, and it was objectively the best thing she'd tasted since she left Missouri. These are good, she said somewhat grudgingly. Dutch oven, he said. Takes practice. Did Ruth teach you? A pause. She tried. I was a slow learner. Figured it out on my own after. He was quiet for a moment. She always said any man who expected to live alone in the mountains better know how to cook because nobody was coming to rescue him. Evelyn looked at the ridge. She was right. Usually was, he said. They ate the rest of the biscuits without talking. It was the kind of quiet that had stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like company. Then Del Garrow rode into the yard, and the morning went sideways. He came with another man she didn't know, younger, wearing a suit that wasn't from anywhere local, carrying a leather satchel that said County Assessor's Office on the side. Evelyn looked at Caleb. Briggs moved fast, Caleb said under his breath. Miss Harper, Garrow said. He was doing the friendly voice again, the one that didn't quite reach his eyes. This is Mr. Aldous Webb. He's been asked to conduct a routine assessment of the property. By whom? Evelyn said. It was requested through the county office, Webb said. He had the apologetic efficiency of a man who delivered bad news for a living and had stopped feeling bad about it. Standard procedure when a property changes hands and there are questions about current. There are no questions about the title, Evelyn said. The title is clear. I have certified documentation. It's not about the title, Webb said. It's about current property condition and viability, whether the land meets county standards for active agricultural use. I've been here 3 weeks, she said. The land is being actively worked. I have a functioning water source, repaired structures, and a cleared fence line. She looked at Garrow. Who specifically requested this assessment? Garrow opened his mouth. Webb got there first. The request was filed anonymously through the county office, he said. That's permitted under the agricultural review statutes. Caleb stepped forward. Just one step. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He was 6 feet of settled, immovable presence, and Garrow looked at him the way men always looked at Caleb Thornton when he stepped forward, like they were abruptly recalculating. Mr. Webb, Evelyn said, you're welcome to conduct your assessment. I have nothing to hide and nothing to worry about. I'd like a copy of your report filed with the sheriff's office in addition to the county office. Webb blinked. That's not standard. It is now, she said, for this property. He wrote it down. The assessment took 2 hours. Evelyn walked every foot of it with him. She answered every question completely and accurately, and she offered nothing beyond what was asked, because she'd learned from her father, who had spent 30 years dealing with equipment inspectors and city officials, that the only mistake you made with assessors was giving them more than they came for. At the end of it, Webb closed his notebook. The property appears to be in active use, he said carefully. It is, she said. The water source you showed me, the new well, it's been dug recently. 3 weeks ago, she said. I have documentation of the work and the water test results. I can have copies for you by end of week. He looked at his notebook. I don't think that will be necessary. I'll send them anyway, she said, for the record. He got back in his buggy. Garrow had said almost nothing the entire time, which was somehow more uncomfortable than if he'd said a great deal. When they were gone, Caleb said, He's got nothing. He never had anything, she said. That's not the point. The point is, Briggs gets to say he had an assessment done. He plants the idea that there was a reason for one. What do you want to do? She looked at the property. At the fence line, the new well frame, the repaired porch, the stack of lumber against the north wall. 3 weeks of work. The beginning of something. I want to finish the north wall, she said. And then I want to have the best yield in the valley by September. That's what I want to do. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Past the neighborhood of one this time. Closer to something warmer. "All right," he said. "I'll get the other end of the lumber." The north wall took 4 days. They worked it in sections, Evelyn doing the framing and Caleb doing the heavy lifting, without comment on who was doing what, which was exactly right. He came every morning and stayed until the light went. On the second evening they ate supper at her table. She made stew because she had the ingredients and it was practical. And he told her about the valley before Briggs had started buying, when there had been half a dozen small operations running and neighboring had meant something other than competition. "What happened to them?" she said. "Briggs bought 3 out directly," Caleb said. 2 left because the winters were too hard and they hadn't come prepared. 1 died older man, no family. He turned his cup. "It was different when there were more of us. When Harmon Kessel was still running his place on the South Creek, we used to do communal branding in the spring. Shared equipment. It made sense." He paused. "After they were all gone, it was just me. And Briggs watching." "Why didn't he push you harder?" she said. 7 years is a long time to wait." Caleb looked at the table. "Because I didn't give him the leverage. Every time he pushed, I just stayed. Didn't react. Didn't talk. Let the work stand for itself." He looked up. "And because after Ruth died, I think he thought I'd leave on my own. He didn't want to push a man who'd just lost his wife and make himself look like something the county would notice." "Politics," she said. "Everything's politics," he said. "Out here it's just politics with less furniture." She laughed at that, a real one, unexpected. He looked slightly startled by it, like a man who'd made a joke and hadn't been sure it would land. "You're funnier than you look," she said. "Not a high bar," he said. "I disagree," she said. And then she looked directly at him, and he looked directly at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and it was the loudest silence she'd experienced in years. She stood up and cleared the plates. He put his hat on and said goodnight, and rode home in the dark, and she sat at her uncle's table afterward, and looked at the 2 cups still on the table, and thought about how the cabin had felt full tonight. How it had felt like a home instead of a project. She thought about that for too long before she made herself stop. The letter from Briggs came on a Saturday. Not a purchase offer this time. It came through his attorney formal letterhead, 3 paragraphs of careful legal language that boiled down to this. Briggs was claiming a historical grazing right over the southern 20 feet of her property, based on an informal arrangement allegedly made with her uncle 7 years prior. He had a signed statement from 2 witnesses who claimed to have been present at the agreement. He was asking the county to record the right formally. She read it twice, slowly. Then she set it on the table and did not swear out loud because she was alone and it seemed wasteful. She rode to town. Not to the sheriff, not yet. She went to the telegraph office and sent a wire to her uncle's attorney. 3 sentences. Briggs claiming historical grazing right. Says agreement with my uncle 7 years ago. 2 witnesses. Need uncle's papers searched immediately. The attorney wired back in 2 days. No record of any such agreement. Your uncle's papers contain explicit notation rejecting Briggs's grazing request, signed and dated 8 years prior. Sending full documentation. 8 years prior. A year before the alleged agreement. Her uncle had written down the rejection, dated it, kept it. She held the wire, and she thought about her uncle sitting at this table, writing that notation, knowing Briggs was going to try again, wanting there to be something in writing when he did. Preparing for a fight he knew was coming. Leaving her the tools to finish it. "You knew," she said out loud to the empty cabin. "You knew he'd try and you left me the answer." She pressed her hand flat on the table for a moment. Let herself feel it, the grief and the gratitude tangled up together, the way they always were with him. Then she put the wire in her satchel and rode to Caleb's. He read the wire without comment. Read it again. Then he said, "He overplayed." "Yes," she said. "He thought you wouldn't be able to document a negative. Proving something didn't happen is harder than proving something did." He handed the wire back. "Your uncle's notation changes everything. You've got documentary evidence that Briggs's witnesses are lying." "Or mistaken," she said. "They're not mistaken," he said. 2 witnesses who both remember the same thing that didn't happen. That's not coincidence. That's a plan. She looked at him. If I take this to the sheriff, it's my attorney's documentation against 2 local witnesses. That's a credibility fight. Yes, he said. If I take it to the county recorder and formally contest the filing, it goes public. Everyone knows. Yes. And if I do nothing, it sits in the county record as a pending claim, and nobody who doesn't already know will dig that far to find out it's false. That's what he's counting on, Caleb said. The same thing he counted on with everyone else. That the cost of fighting is higher than the cost of tolerating. She folded the wire, put it in her pocket. He miscounted, she said. Caleb looked at her with something that was entirely past the neighborhood of a smile now. It was clear and warm and specific, directed at her, and she felt it the way you felt warmth after cold. Yes, he said. He did. She filed the formal contest the following Monday. She stood at the county recorder's desk and submitted her uncle's documentation and her attorney's certified statement and the wire she'd received, and she asked for the Briggs grazing claim to be formally disputed on the record. The recorder, a thin young man who looked like he hadn't expected his Tuesday to go this way, read through the documents 3 times before he stamped them. "This is comprehensive," he said, which was not what county recorders usually said. "I had a thorough uncle," she said. Word reached Red Hollow before she was on the road back. She could see it on the face of the man who tipped his hat to her outside the land office. Not the calculating assessment she'd gotten on her first day, but something else. Something that was beginning tentatively to look like regard. Mrs. Holt found her at the general store. "I heard you filed," she said without preamble, the way she did everything. "I filed," Evelyn said. "You know Briggs won't leave this alone." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking him to. I'm just making sure there's a record of everything he tries." Mrs. Holt studied her for a long moment. "Your uncle used to say the land out there either breaks you or builds you." "He said that to me too," Evelyn said. "What do you think he meant?" "I think he meant it's not the land that decides," Evelyn said. "It's you." Mrs. Holt nodded once sharply, in the way of a woman who had gotten the answer she was looking for. "Come for supper Thursday," she said. "I want to introduce you to a few people who've been watching what you're doing and thinking it might be time to stop watching from a distance." Evelyn thought about it. 3 weeks ago, she would have said no. Instinctively, she didn't need a network, she could do this herself. 3 weeks of Wyoming had revised that position. "I'll be there," she said. She rode home in the mid-afternoon and tied the horse and stood in front of the cabin for a moment, just looking at it. The porch was solid now. The north wall was finished. She could see the new well frame from where she stood, the casing pipe going in clean, the cover cut, and waiting. She could see the fence line running straight and deep. 3 weeks. It looked like something now. It looked like hers. She went inside and put the kettle on, and took out her uncle's letter again, not to read it, just to hold it. The paper was getting soft at the folds from handling. "I think you'll love these mountains if you give them half a chance." She was beginning to understand that she already did. That she had, maybe from the moment she opened his letter in that small St. Joseph apartment, and felt something in her chest, loosened something that had been tight for years at the idea of having a place that needed her to show up and stay. The kettle began to whistle. She put the letter down and got up. There was still 2 hours of daylight left, and she had work to do. She was halfway through checking the south fence line, her now habitual end-of-day routine, because you only needed one lesson about Briggs's cattle to make checking a daily practice, when she heard a horse coming hard from the north road. Too fast for casual. She turned and waited. It was a boy she half recognized, maybe 14, red-faced from riding in the summer heat. He pulled up hard when he saw her. "Miss Harper," he said, gasping it slightly. "Catch your breath," she said. He did. Then, "Mr. Thornton sent me. Said to tell you there's been a meeting, tonight, at the Briggs place." He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his shirt. He wrote it down. She took the paper. Caleb's handwriting was what she might have expected, spare no wasted ink. "Briggs called a meeting with 4 Valley landowners tonight. I'm going. You should know. Come if you want to." She read it twice. "How long ago did he send you?" she said. "Maybe an hour," the boy said. The Briggs place was 7 miles south. The meeting was at sundown, which gave her maybe 3 hours. She looked at the fence line. She looked at the paper. She folded it, tucked it in her pocket, and walked to the barn to saddle her horse. She was going. Not because she was invited. Not because she had the right by anyone's reckoning except her own. But because whatever was being decided in that room tonight was going to affect this land, her land, and she had learned from 3 weeks of Wyoming and 7 years of her uncle's letters, and a lifetime of being told to wait quietly in other rooms, that the moment you stopped being in the room was the moment the room made decisions you had to live with. She saddled up, checked the cinch, mounted, looked north at the ridge purple in the evening light exactly as her uncle had described it. "I'm paying attention," she said to the mountains, to him, to herself. She rode south. She heard the voices before she reached the gate. The Briggs property was lit up like a town hall, meeting lanterns in the yard, horses tied 6 deep along the fence rail, and the low rumble of men talking over each other, filtering through the walls of the main barn. Evelyn counted the horses as she rode in. 14. More than Caleb's note had suggested. This wasn't 4 landowners and a conversation. This was something else. She tied her horse at the far end of the line and walked toward the barn door without hesitating, because hesitating at the threshold was how you announced that you weren't sure you belonged there, and she'd decided on the ride down that she wasn't going to give anyone that. The talking stopped when she pushed the door open. 14 men. Briggs at the far end, standing behind a workbench he'd cleared and turned into a makeshift table. Del Garrow to his left. 6 men she recognized from town. The rest from the Valley ranchers, a couple of farmhands who'd come with their employers. The deputy sheriff who had taken her trespass report and now looked like he wished he were somewhere else. Caleb was against the right wall, arms crossed, hat on, watching the door. When she walked in, something in his posture shifted, not surprise. He'd been waiting to see if she'd come. "Miss Harper," Briggs said. His voice was controlled, but his eyes went to Garrow for half a second before coming back to her. "This is a private meeting." "Of Valley landowners," she said. "I'm a Valley landowner." She moved to the right wall and stood beside Caleb without asking permission. "Go ahead." Nobody moved for a moment. Then the deputy cleared his throat, and Briggs redirected his attention forward, and the meeting resumed. What she walked into was this. Briggs was proposing a Valley Water Compact, a formal agreement among the surrounding landowners to manage the creek system collectively, with a governing committee, himself as chair naturally, that would allocate water rights, resolve disputes, and set standards for land use. On paper, it was reasonable. It was the kind of arrangement that made sense in a dry summer, the kind that older valleys with more history had been running for years. What it actually was, she understood within 5 minutes of listening, was a mechanism. A committee that controlled water rights, controlled the land those water rights attached to. A committee chaired by Briggs, with a majority of members he'd personally invited to this meeting, would have the practical authority to restrict water access to any property he wanted restricted, including hers, including Caleb's. She listened to the whole pitch without speaking. She watched the other men in the room, some nodding, some uncertain. One older rancher in the back, who was frowning at the proposed charter document. The way you frowned at something that smelled wrong before you'd identified why. When Briggs finished, he said, "I'd like to move to a vote." "I have questions," Evelyn said. Briggs looked at her. A room full of men looked at her. The deputy looked at the wall. "Miss Harper," Briggs said with the particular patience of a man performing patience, "as I said, this is a meeting of Valley landowners," she said. "Which I am. My questions first, then your vote." She pulled out the copy of the proposed charter she'd gotten a look at when Garrow had set it on the bench. She'd read it fast, 2 pages dense, but the structure was clear. Section 4, subsection 3. The committee has authority to restrict, suspend, or redirect water access in cases of land use non-compliance. Who defines non-compliance? Silence. "The charter doesn't say," she said, "which means the committee does. Which means the chair does in practice, since the charter gives the chair a tie-breaking vote." Tie-breaking vote. She looked at the older rancher in the back, the one who'd been frowning. "Mr. Oaks," he said. "Harlan Oaks, South Valley." Mr. Oakes, your south property runs off the same creek system as my land. It does, he said carefully. If this compact passes and the committee decides your land use doesn't comply, whatever that means, however they define it that month, they can cut your water. Oakes looked at the charter document in Briggs's hand. His frown deepened. That ain't what Walter said this was, Oakes said. That's what the language says, Evelyn said. The room shifted. Not dramatically, not yet. But the quality of the attention changed. Men who had been nodding were now holding still. Briggs set the charter down on the bench. Miss Harper is reading language out of context, he said, and his voice was smooth, the practiced smoothness of a man who had redirected rooms before. The intent of this compact is cooperative management. We've all dealt with dry summers. We all know what happens when. Then change the language, Evelyn said. If the intent is cooperative, write the charter so the committee can't unilaterally restrict any individual owner's access without a full majority vote and a 30-day written notice period. She looked around the room. If that's the intent, that should be easy to agree to. That would make the committee unwieldy, Garrow said. In a genuine emergency. A genuine emergency isn't what Section 4 subsection 3 is designed for, Evelyn said. If it were, it would say emergency. It says non-compliance. Those are different things. The older rancher Oakes stood up. He was a big man, 60-something, the kind of build that used to be muscle, and had settled into something more permanent and possibly more solid. I'd like to see the full language before we vote on anything, he said. I'd like all of us to see it. Agreed, said another man across the room. She didn't know his name, but he had the look of someone who'd been quiet because he was thinking, not because he had nothing to say. Briggs looked at Garrow. The look was controlled, but Evelyn saw it and understood it. They had not expected this particular wrench in this particular gear. We can table the vote, Briggs said. Circulate the full charter. Meet again in 2 weeks. Before we table, Evelyn said, I'd like to raise one more item. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded document. Last week I submitted a formal contest to a grazing rights claim filed against my property. The claim cited a historical agreement between Mr. Briggs and my uncle. She looked at Briggs directly. My uncle's records contain a signed, dated notation explicitly rejecting that request. The date predates the alleged agreement by a year. The room was very quiet. I'm raising it here, she said, because 2 of the witnesses named in Mr. Briggs's claim are men who work for him. And because I think the people in this room who are being asked to sign a compact with Mr. Briggs deserve to know what kind of agreements he puts his name to. Briggs said, That is a legal matter between. It's a matter of character, she said. And you called this meeting. You invited these men. I think they have the right to the full picture. She folded the document and put it back in her satchel. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Oakes said, I think we've all got enough to think about. I'm riding home. He picked up his hat. Walter, I'll read the charter when you send it around, but I want it looked at by my own man before I sign anything. 3 other men said variations of the same thing. The room began to empty, not fast, not dramatically, but steadily. The way a crowd dispersed when the thing they'd come for had turned into something they hadn't expected. Garrow was watching her from across the room with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not hostile, something closer to reassessment. Briggs walked toward her. Caleb took 1 step forward from the wall. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even loud. It was just the precise repositioning of a large, steady man communicating a single clear message close enough. Briggs stopped. You're making enemies, he said to Evelyn. Quietly enough that it was between them and Caleb and nobody else. I'm making a record, she said. There's a difference. Not in this valley there isn't. Then maybe the valley needs updating, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. His face was the controlled, weathered face of a man who had been doing this for 30 years and had not in those 30 years been accustomed to the kind of friction she was generating. He was recalculating. She could see it happening. You're your uncle's niece, he said finally. I am, she said. I take that as a compliment. He walked out. Garrow followed without looking at her. The barn emptied down to her Caleb and Oakes, who was lingering near the door with his hat in his hands. That took nerve, Oakes said. He wasn't being flattering. He was being accurate. It took reading, she said. The nerve was incidental. He looked at her steadily. Your uncle was a good man. Kept to himself, but good. Briggs tried to buy him out 3 times that I know of. He put his hat on. He never tried it a 4th time with Aldred. Wonder why that was. My uncle had good notes, she said. Oakes nodded once, put his hat on, and walked out into the dark. Then it was just her and Caleb, and the guttering lantern on the bench, and the sound of horses leaving outside. He was looking at her, the way he'd looked at the new well, the day she found the water source. Like he was re-evaluating something he'd thought he'd already fully assessed. You read that charter in 4 minutes, he said. I read fast. You knew the subsection numbers. I have a good memory. Evelyn. He said her name for the first time, not Harper, not Miss Harper. Just her name, and the way he said it was careful and specific, like he'd been holding it at a distance and had just decided not to. What did you do before you came here? She picked up her satchel. I managed the books and contracts for my father's equipment shop for 9 years, she said. I read every contract that came through that door. Suppliers, buyers, city inspectors. She looked at him. My father thought it was a waste of a girl's time. I thought it was the most useful thing I could learn. He stood with that for a moment. Briggs didn't know. Briggs saw a woman with a tool chest and a dead uncle's land, she said. He made an assumption. Most people do, Caleb said. Yes, she said. I've found that useful. They walked out together into the summer night, and she was very aware walking beside him of how different the air felt outside that barn than it had inside it. Like pressure released, like breathing after holding it. He untied his horse. She untied hers. They stood between the animals for a moment in the dark. Thank you, she said, for sending the boy. You had the right to know, he said. Most men in your position wouldn't have thought so. I'm not most men, he said simply. She looked at him in the dark, and she thought no. You're not. She rode home under a sky full of stars, and she felt for the first time since she'd arrived in Wyoming that she was not simply surviving. She was winning. Slowly, carefully on her own terms, but winning. She didn't let herself get comfortable about it, which was good, because the next blow came 3 days later, and it was the kind she hadn't seen coming. She was in town posting the weekly update to her attorney when she passed the sheriff's office and saw through the window a man she didn't recognize sitting across from the sheriff. Broad-shouldered, wearing a town suit with the particular posture of a man who had authority somewhere and was used to walking into rooms and having it recognized. She would have kept walking if she hadn't heard her name. She stopped outside the window. She was not proud of what she did next, but she did it. She stood to the side of the window and listened. Harper property, the sheriff was saying. She's been here 5 weeks. No real trouble that I've seen. The filing she submitted, the man in the suit said. Against the Briggs grazing claim. Did you look at the documentation she provided? I reviewed it, the sheriff said. It looked solid to me. Her uncle's notation attorney certified. Her uncle's notation, the suit said, is the issue. A pause. There's a question about whether Aldred Harper had full legal capacity in the period that notation was written. He had no formal diagnosis, but there are neighbors who can attest to erratic behavior in that time frame. If his capacity was in question, the notation may not hold. Evelyn's hand found the side of the building without her intending it to. Who's raising this? The sheriff said. It came to the county attorney's office as an inquiry, the suit said. We're obligated to look into it. She walked away from the window before she heard the rest. She walked to the end of the block and stood there and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she did when she needed to keep her thinking clear and not let what she felt run ahead of what she knew. What she knew. Her uncle had written that notation 8 years ago. He had been 63 at that point, sharp-minded, self-sufficient, running his own land alone. He had written her coherent, detailed letters until the month before he died 4 months ago. The notion that he had lacked capacity 8 years prior was not just wrong, it was fabricated. What she also knew, fabrication didn't need to be true. It needed to be plausible enough to create delay to muddy the documentation she'd submitted to give Briggs's grazing claim enough of a question mark to survive in the county record while the case was examined. She went to the telegraph office and sent a wire to her attorney that said, "New attack." Claiming uncle lacked capacity when notation written. Need documentation of his competence in that period. Letters, contracts, anything dated. Then she went to Mrs. Holt's dry goods counter because Mrs. Holt was the most connected person she'd found in Red Hollow, and she needed information faster than she could get it alone. Mrs. Holt listened to the whole thing without interrupting. "The man in the suit," she said when Evelyn finished. "Was he wearing a silver watch chain, heavy one?" "I didn't notice." "Tall, little, thin brown hair going gray at the temples?" "Yes." "That's Franklin Cobb," Mrs. Holt said. "He's a county attorney, but he does private work on the side. He's done work for Briggs before, twice that I know of, maybe more." Evelyn felt the shape of it solidify. Not a county inquiry, a directed one. "I need people who knew my uncle," she said. "People who can say clearly what he was like 8 years ago. His neighbors, anyone who did business with him." Mrs. Holt was already untying her apron. "Harlan Oaks bought breeding stock from your uncle in that period. I know because I helped Aldred with the paperwork he asked me to check his figures." She paused, meeting Evelyn's eyes. "The man was sharp as a tack. He caught an arithmetic error I missed. I remember because he didn't make me feel bad about it." "Would Oaks say that on record?" "If you ask him right," Mrs. Holt said. "Harlan Oaks doesn't do things he doesn't want to do, but he doesn't like being lied to, and he doesn't like liars. If you go to him with the full picture, he'll make up his own mind." She went to Oaks that afternoon. He was in his barn. She told him everything, the man in the suit, the capacity argument, what she needed. She didn't soften it, and she didn't ask for sympathy. She asked for the facts as he remembered them. He listened, same as he had in the Briggs barn. Then he said, "Aldred Harper had a better mind than half the men in this valley when he was at his peak. 8 years ago, he was at his peak." He picked up a bridle he'd been repairing and turned it in his hands. "He negotiated the breeding stock price down by $12 a head, and I didn't notice it until I rode home. I went back and checked the contract, and he was right. The price I'd agreed to verbally was higher than what we'd discussed a week prior. He remembered the earlier number and held me to it. 'Would you write that down?' she said. 'Sign it.' He looked at her steadily. 'You're asking me to go up against Briggs.' 'I'm asking you to tell the truth about a man who's dead and can't speak for himself,' she said. 'Briggs is a separate issue.' He thought about it. Not long. 'I'll write it down,' he said. 'Bring me paper.' She had paper in her satchel. She always had paper in her satchel. He wrote it there in his barn, in the careful, large handwriting of a man who didn't write often, but when he did wrote clearly. He described the breeding stock transaction. He described Aldred Harper's specific recall of the price discussion. He described the man's manner and bearing and the quality of his thinking. He signed it and dated it and handed it back. 'Your uncle helped me once,' he said. 'Not the cattle business, something else, personal.' He didn't elaborate. 'I've owed him for a while. This feels like the right way to settle it.' She rode back toward home, with Oakes's statement in her satchel and her attorney's wire to follow up on, and something building in her chest that was not quite calm and not quite anger, but somewhere between them, a kind of focused heat. The feeling she recognized from years of sitting across tables from men who thought the paperwork was their territory. It wasn't their territory. It was everybody's territory. It always had been. She was almost to the North Fork of the road, 20 minutes from home, when she heard the rider behind her. She turned. Garrow. He pulled up alongside her and matched her pace, rather than stopping, which told her this wasn't a hostile approach. A hostile approach stopped you. This was something else. 'Miss Harper,' he said. 'Mr. Garrow.' They rode parallel for a moment. 'The capacity argument,' he said. 'That wasn't my idea.' She kept her eyes on the road. 'All right. I want that on record,' he said. 'Between us. I've done work for Briggs. I won't pretend otherwise. But there's a line between business and—' He paused. 'What he's doing to that dead man's reputation. That's a different thing.' She looked at him then. He was riding with the slightly tight posture of a man having a conversation he hadn't fully planned but had decided to have anyway. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because I've got a daughter," he said. "She's 12. Smart as hell, pardon the language. And the way Briggs talks about you when you're not there." He stopped, started again. "I keep thinking about what I'd want somebody to do if it was her 20 years from now." Evelyn said nothing for a long moment. "Is there anything useful you can tell me?" she said. Garrow was quiet. His horse moved under him. Then, Briggs's grazing claim, the two witnesses. One of them is his nephew. The other is a man named Cord Halsey, who works Briggs's south pasture. Halsey's been in debt to Briggs for 3 years. He can't say no to the man. She absorbed that. "Halsey's name is on the county record," she said. "Yes. If someone showed Halsey that his name was on a document making a false claim and explained that false claims in county records carry legal consequences, he'd fold," Garrow said. "Halsey's not a bad man. He's a scared one." He looked at her. "I can't be the one to approach him, but somebody could." She thought about what she was hearing and what it meant. "Why are you telling me this?" she said again. Not accusatory, genuine. "Because Briggs is going to lose," Garrow said, "and I've been in this valley long enough to know which way to be standing when that happens." He turned off at the fork without another word and rode south. Evelyn sat on her horse in the middle of the road for a full 30 seconds after he was gone. Then she turned her horse north and rode hard for home because there were plans to make, and she worked better when she could write things down. She had 3 items on her table that night: Oakes's signed statement, her attorney's documentation request, Garrow's information about Halsey. She needed one more thing. She needed someone Halsey would talk to, someone he trusted enough to be honest with without feeling like he was being cornered. She rode to Caleb's in the morning before he'd finished his coffee. He opened the cabin door and looked at her standing on his porch at 6:45 in the morning and said, "What happened?" She told him. He listened the same way he always listened, entirely, without interrupting, without performing either concern or composure, just receiving it. When she finished, he said, "I know Cord Halsey." "I thought you might." "He was here before the debt," Caleb said. "Good hand. Hard worker. He borrowed from Briggs when his wife got sick, and he's been paying for it ever since." He set his cup down. "If I go to him, he needs to know what he signed his name to," she said. "He needs to know the legal exposure. He needs to know there's a way out of it that doesn't leave him worse off than he is now. And if he won't listen, then we're where we are," she said. "But I think he will." Caleb looked at her. "You trust Garrow's read on this?" "I trust that Garrow saw which way the wind was blowing and decided to be useful," she said. "The why doesn't matter much. The information is either accurate or it isn't." "That's a cold way to think about it." "It's an efficient way," she said. "I can be sentimental about it later." He looked at her for a moment, with something she was beginning to recognize, that particular expression he wore when she'd said something that surprised him, and he hadn't decided yet whether to say so. "All right," he said. "I'll talk to Halsey." "Today," she said. "Today," he agreed. "I went that afternoon." She stayed at the homestead and worked the north pasture and tried not to count the hours, because counting hours was how you made them longer. She replaced a split post on the north line and cleared a root tangle from the creek bank that had been slowing the water flow, and she checked the new well, which was coming in clean and strong, and she did not think about Caleb writing to a man she'd never met, to ask him to undo a lie he'd been put up to by a man he owed money to. She thought about it anyway. He came back at dusk. She heard his horse and came around from the creek bank, and he dismounted and tied his horse and came to where she was standing, and she read his face before he said a word. "He'll do it," Caleb said. "He'll submit a retraction." She breathed out. "I was relieved," Caleb said. "That's the word I'd use. He's been sick about it since he signed. He didn't know it was going to be used as part of a larger scheme. He thought he was just vouching for something he half remembered." He shook his head. "Briggs told him your uncle had agreed to the grazing rights verbally, that it just hadn't been written down, and that the county needed someone to confirm the conversation had happened." And he believed him. "He wanted to," Caleb said. "He owes the man 2 years of work. You don't look too hard at things when you owe someone. She thought about that. About the mechanics of obligation, how they worked on people. How Briggs had built his operation not just on money and land, but on debt, on the leverage that came from being the person other people needed. His debt, she said, to Briggs. He's afraid of it. If the grazing claim fails, she said slowly, Briggs loses credibility in the county record. If it comes out that he manufactured the claim with an unwilling witness, that's not just a failed filing. That's a pattern the county attorney's office would have a hard time ignoring. Caleb looked at her. He was seeing where she was going. If Briggs is exposed as filing false claims, she said, the county would look at the other properties, the ones he bought, the ones that sold after his filings. She looked at Caleb. Including the 3 open filings against your land. Something moved through his expression. Not surprised, he was already thinking it. Something more like, this woman just named what I've been carrying for 7 years and made it a problem we're solving rather than a weight I'm bearing. That's a big game to play, he said. Yes, she said. You ready for it? She looked at the homestead, at everything she'd built and fixed and found and fought for in 5 weeks. At the ridge going dark against the sky to the north. At the letter in her mind that she didn't need to hold anymore because she'd finally stopped needing to read it to remember it. They're hard on people who aren't paying attention, but they're fair. I've been ready since I stepped off that coach, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The light was going, but she could see his face clearly, the certainty in it, the thing that had been building since the first day he'd watched her set fence posts and decided she was someone worth watching. Then let's finish it, he said. She nodded. She turned back toward the cabin, and he fell into step beside her, and neither of them said anything else because some things didn't need words. The plan was already moving. What they didn't know yet. What she wouldn't discover until the following morning when a wire arrived from her attorney that changed everything. She thought she knew about the land she was standing on, was that the fight wasn't just about grazing rights or water compacts or manufactured witnesses. It was about what was underneath the ground itself, and Briggs had known it since before her uncle died. The wire from her attorney arrived at 7 in the morning. She'd been up since 5, which had become her habit. The mountains didn't wait for sleep schedules, and neither did the work. She was at the new well checking the casing. When she heard the livery boy coming up the road at a trot, which was unusual enough that she put down her tools and walked to meet him. He handed her the envelope without dismounting. Came in last night, he said. Mr. Pearson said to get it out to you first thing. She tipped him a coin, and he turned around and rode back toward town, and she stood in the morning light and opened the envelope. Her attorney had written 2 pages, which was twice his usual length, which told her before she read a word that something significant had happened. She read it standing in the yard, and by the second paragraph, her hand was gripping the paper hard enough to crease it. The title search, she had requested the deep one, going back through every recorded interest and survey and mineral filing in the county record, had turned up something that had not been in the original transfer documentation. Something that should have been disclosed and hadn't been. Her uncle's land sat over a documented underground water table. Not just the aquifer she'd found when she dug the new well. A larger system, a substantial one, the kind that a surveyor had mapped and recorded with the Territorial Office 12 years ago in a report commissioned by a land development consortium that had subsequently dissolved. The survey existed in the territorial record. It had never made it into the county record, which was either an administrative failure or something deliberate. The survey showed that the water table extended under 4 adjacent properties. 3 of those properties currently belong to Walter Briggs. She read the paragraph 3 times. Then she read the part that made everything else make sense 18 months ago. A railroad-affiliated land company out of Denver had filed a preliminary inquiry with the Territorial Office about water access rights in the Red Hollow Valley. They were looking at the possibility of a water-dependent rail servicing operation. They needed a guaranteed water source. They needed land with documented water rights. Her land. Her uncle's land, specifically because it sat at the head of the table. The source point, the property that controlled access to the whole system. Briggs hadn't been trying to buy her uncle's land because he wanted more acreage. He'd been trying to buy it because he knew about the railroad inquiry. He knew what the water rights were going to be worth, and he needed to control the source property before anyone else figured out what it sat on. Her uncle had refused to sell, and then her uncle had died. And then the land had gone to her, a woman from Missouri, with a tool chest and a dead man's deed, and Briggs had looked at her and thought easier. She walked inside. She sat at the table. She put the wire down flat in front of her and pressed both hands on the surface and stayed very still for almost a full minute. She was not going to cry. She wasn't crying. But her uncle had known, she was almost certain he had known or suspected why Briggs wanted the land so badly. And he had still left it to her. He had left her the deed and the papers and the notation he'd written to protect it, and he had trusted her to figure out the rest. She had figured out the rest. She picked up her hat and walked out the door and saddled her horse. Caleb was at his corral fence when she rode in. He took one look at her face and said, "What is it?" She handed him the wire. He read it. He read it again. He looked up at her. "Railroad water rights," he said. "That's what he's been after the whole time," she said. The grazing claim, the water compact, the capacity argument, none of it was about the land. It was about making sure he controlled the water table access before the railroad deal formalized. Caleb looked back at the wire. She watched him process it the way he processed everything completely without rushing, turning it over to see all sides. "The railroad inquiry," he said. "Is it still active?" "My attorney is checking. He sent a follow-up wire to the territorial office yesterday." "If it's still active," Caleb said, "and if the land company knows there's a contested ownership situation, they'll wait," she said, "or they'll go somewhere else. Either way, Briggs loses his window." She looked at him. "But if I can document clear title and clean water rights before the situation gets muddier, the value of the land is established. My claim is established. And everything Briggs has been trying to do becomes not just unsuccessful, but visible. On the record. Permanent." Caleb handed the wire back. He was very still in the way he got still when he was thinking hard. "How long do you have?" he said. "I don't know. My attorney is moving fast." "Cord Halsey's retraction," Caleb said. "I was going to accompany him to the county recorder's office Friday. We need to move that up." "Today," she said. "Today," he agreed. He was already untying his horse. They rode to Halsey's place together, hard and fast, and Caleb went to the door while Evelyn waited with the horses. She heard voices inside Caleb's, low and direct. Another voice she didn't know, tense at first, and then quieter. 3 minutes. That was all it took. Halsey came out pulling his coat on. He was a lean man, mid-40s, with the lined face of someone who had been worried for a long time. He looked at Evelyn, the way a man looked at someone whose name had been used against them, without their full understanding of how. "Miss Harper," he said. "I'm sorry." "I know," she said. "Let's go fix it." They rode 3 abreast to Red Hollow, and Halsey submitted his retraction to the county recorder. A written statement, retracting his witness testimony in the Briggs grazing claim, filing citing that he had been presented with a misleading account of the alleged agreement, and that he had no direct knowledge of any grazing arrangement between Walter Briggs and Aldred Harper. He signed it in front of the recorder and asked for a receipt. The recorder looked at the document, looked at Evelyn, looked at Caleb, standing just inside the door with his arms crossed and his hat on, and stamped the document without commentary. They were back on the street in under 20 minutes. Halsey stood with his horse and looked at Evelyn. "Briggs is going to know by tonight," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you all right? Are you all?" He thought about it honestly. "I'll manage," he said. "The debt's still there, but—" He stopped. "At least my name's not on something false anymore." "If Briggs retaliates against you over this," Evelyn said, "document everything. Date it. Write it down and bring it to me." He looked at her with something surprised in it. "Why would you—" "Because you did the right thing," she said. "And because if Briggs thinks he can punish people for telling the truth, that's useful information to have on record." She held his gaze. "You're not alone in this anymore, Mr. Halsey. Neither am I." He nodded. He mounted up and rode south with the slightly different posture of a man who had put something down he'd been carrying too long. Caleb watched him go. "That was well done," he said. He needed to hear it, she said. They were walking back toward the land office to file a copy of Halsey's retraction alongside her existing contest when she heard her name from across the street. She turned. It was the deputy, the same one who'd been at the Briggs meeting, the same one who'd taken her trespass report. He was crossing toward her with purpose. "Miss Harper." He stopped in front of her. His hat was in his hands. "I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you fast, because Cobb left for the county seat this morning, and I don't know how much time you have." "Tell me," she said. "The capacity argument," he said. "Cobb filed a formal petition with the county court this morning, before he left. It's asking the court to hold your uncle's notation in abeyance pending a competency review." He looked at her steadily. "If the court grants the hold, your entire contest of the grazing claim gets frozen. Everything you've filed, until the review is complete." "How long does a review take?" Caleb said. "Months," the deputy said. "Sometimes longer, and while it's pending, the grazing claim sits as an open question," Evelyn said. "And anyone who wants to do business with this land, say a railroad land company, sees a title dispute and walks away." "Yes, ma'am," the deputy said. He had the look of a man who had been watching something wrong happen for a long time and had finally decided he was done watching. "I've worked for the sheriff for 6 years. I've seen Briggs operate before. Not like this. Not this many moves at once." He paused. "Your uncle, I knew him a little. He came in once a year to file his annual record. Always correct, always early. Not the kind of man who lacked capacity." He put his hat back on. "Thought you should know about the petition." "Thank you," she said. And she meant it fully. He touched his hat and walked back across the street. She stood on the boardwalk and ran the timeline in her head. Cobb had filed this morning. The county court at the seat was a 2-hour ride. If the petition was filed before noon, a judge could review it today. A hold could be granted as early as tomorrow. "How fast can your attorney respond?" Caleb said. He was reading the same math. "If I wire him in the next hour," she said, "he can be at the county seat before the end of the business day." She was already moving toward the telegraph office. "I need Oakes's statement delivered to the court along with everything else. If the judge sees competing documentation before the hold is granted." "I'll ride to Oakes," Caleb said. "Get the original statement. How long do you need at the telegraph?" 10 minutes. "I'll be back in 40. How was gone before she reached the telegraph office door. She wrote the wire standing at the fast and precise, her attorney's name, the situation, what she needed, where by when. The operator read it back to her, and she corrected one word and approved it and paid and was back outside in 8 minutes. She used the remaining time to go to the land office and formally request a copy of every document she'd filed there. The full record stamped and certified because she wanted her own copy of the complete file independent of what sat in the county drawer. The clerk, who had been progressively less dismissive with each of her visits, pulled the full file without comment and stamped the copies himself. "You're thorough," he said, not unkindly. "I had a thorough uncle," she said for the second time. Caleb came back in 38 minutes with Oakes's original statement, and Oakes himself, who had apparently decided that riding to the county seat was something he was willing to do, if it meant putting the matter to rest. "I'm 71 years old," Oakes said when she looked at him in surprise. "I've been letting Briggs operate in this valley for 30 years because it was easier. I'm done finding it easier." He adjusted his hat. "Who else is coming?" She looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at her. "Mrs. Holt," she said. "She witnessed my uncle's work firsthand, and she talks to more people than she realizes." "I'll get her," Oakes said. What assembled outside the telegraph office 40 minutes later was not an army. It was 4 people, Evelyn, Caleb, Oakes, and Mrs. Holt, who had locked the dry goods counter and come without being told twice. But the 4 of them together constituted something that Walter Briggs had not, in 30 years of operating in this valley, successfully put together people who knew the truth and were willing to ride somewhere and say it on record. They rode for the county seat. The road was 2 hours of hard summer riding, and they didn't waste it on silence. Mrs. Holt told Evelyn as they rode about the first time she'd seen Briggs operate 12 years ago. a young couple who'd come from Indiana with a baby and a homestead filing and the full intention of making something of themselves. Briggs had moved against them within a month. By spring, they were gone. "I should have done something then," Mrs. Holt said. It wasn't self-pity. It was the plain accounting of a woman who kept accurate books on herself. "I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself they should have been better prepared." She rode without looking at Evelyn. "I've told myself that about a lot of people over the years. I stopped believing it some time ago. I just hadn't found the right moment to do anything about it." "This is the moment," Evelyn said. "Yes," Mrs. Holt said. "It is." They reached the county seat at midday. Her attorney was already there. He'd ridden through the night from Kansas City, which told her more about how seriously he was taking this than any wire could have conveyed. He was a compact man named Eustace Pryor, 50s, with the unhurried manner of someone whose unhurriedness was a deliberate professional choice. He met them in the street outside the courthouse. "The petition is filed," he said. "The judge hasn't ruled yet. He's reviewing it this afternoon." He looked at Oakes and Mrs. Holt. "These are witnesses. Direct knowledge of Aldred Harper's competence in the relevant period," Evelyn said. "Oakes has a signed statement. Mrs. Holt has direct personal testimony of working alongside my uncle on financial records." Pryor looked at them both. He nodded once decisively. "Come with me." What happened next was not dramatic in the way that public scenes were dramatic. It was the quieter, more absolute drama of paperwork and testimony, and the precise, careful weight of documented truth. Pryor filed a counterpetition. He submitted her uncle's records, the notation, the surrounding correspondence, the annual filings that showed consistent, detailed, accurate management of the property for 20 consecutive years. He submitted Oakes's statement and Mrs. Holt's sworn account of reviewing financial records with Aldred Harper, and finding his arithmetic not just accurate, but superior to her own. The judge, a gray-haired man named Connolly, who had the expression of someone who had heard a great many things in his courtroom and found most of them tiresome, reviewed both petitions in the same session, which was unusual enough that Pryor had clearly asked for it specifically. Evelyn sat on the bench outside the judge's office and did not pace, because pacing was what you did when you'd run out of useful things to do, and she hadn't. Caleb sat beside her. He didn't talk. He didn't need to. At one point his hand found the bench between them, not touching her just there. Present. She was aware of it the way you were aware of warmth from a fire, not dramatic, just real. After an hour and 20 minutes, Pryor came out. "The hold is denied," he said. She breathed. Judge Connolly found the documentation of competence sufficient to reject the petition on its face, Pryor said. He also noted, and this is the important part, that the petition was filed on the same morning that a witness retraction was submitted in the underlying grazing claim, and that the timing raised questions about the petition's purpose. He paused. "He's referred the matter to the Territorial Attorney's Office for review of potential filing abuse." Oakes, who had been standing behind Pryor, made a sound that was not quite a word, but communicated his feelings clearly. Mrs. Holt pressed her lips together in the particular way she had when she was very satisfied and didn't feel the need to perform it. Caleb looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. "Filing abuse," she said. "That's the open filings against your property too." "I know," he said. "If the Territorial Office reviews Briggs's pattern of filings—" "I know," he said again, quieter, differently. She understood what was in it. 7 years of those open filings sitting against his land. 3 attempts Briggs had made against the spread he'd built alone after Ruth in the winters that could have broken him and hadn't. The possibility that those filings might finally formally be called what they were. "All right," she said. "All right." They rode back in the long afternoon light, the 4 of them, and the conversation was different on the return. Easier, less pressured, the particular release of people who had been carrying something and set it down. Mrs. Holt told a story about her late husband that was funny in a dry, affectionate way that told Evelyn more about the woman in 3 minutes than 3 months of transactions across a dry goods counter would have. Oakes rode with the slightly younger posture of a man who had done something he was glad of. Caleb rode beside Evelyn and said little, but the silence was the good kind, the kind that had stopped being distance and started being company. They were a mile from Red Hollow when Oaks said, "There's going to be a meeting." Evelyn looked at him. "What kind?" "The kind I should have called 10 years ago," he said. "Valley landowners, real ones, not Briggs's selection." He looked at her. "You'd be welcome." "I'll be there," she said. "Thornton," Oaks said. "Yes," Caleb said. "You've been alone out on that north spread for 7 years," Oaks said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. You should have had neighbors," Oaks said. The word carried weight in it, not apology exactly, but something adjacent. Acknowledgement. The recognition of something that should have been different. "That's going to change." Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'd appreciate that." They rode into Red Hollow as the early evening light came down gold over the storefronts, and she felt the difference immediately. Or maybe she felt herself differently, the way the town looked when you were no longer a stranger in it. Or at least when you were a stranger who had done enough to earn a different kind of looking. The deputy was on the boardwalk in front of the sheriff's office. He saw them come in and nodded, not the careful official nod of a man covering his bases, but something more straightforward. She nodded back. Del Guerra was coming out of the feed store. He saw her, saw Oaks, saw Caleb. He stopped. He looked like a man doing the final calculation in his head. Then he tipped his hat. She rode past without stopping, but she acknowledged it. A small nod, nothing more, or because acknowledgement cost nothing, and he had done the thing that mattered. They parted at the north end of town. Oaks and Mrs. Holt went their separate ways with the business-like efficiency of people who had full lives they'd taken time out of. Caleb rode north with Evelyn because his place was north of hers, and they were going the same direction, and it was practical. They didn't speak for the first mile. The ridge was going orange and purple above them, and the air had started to cool the way it did in July evenings at elevation, cutting through the summer heat, with the reminder that this was mountain country, and mountain country kept its own rules. "Your attorney," Caleb said finally. "Pryor. He rode through the night to get there." "He's thorough," she said. "You inspire that in people," he said. "Thoroughness." She looked at him. He was watching the road, not her, but there was something different in his posture, the slightly less armored quality he had on horseback in the evenings compared to in the mornings when the day was still ahead and required vigilance. "Do I?" she said. "You don't notice it," he said. "That's probably why it works." He paused. "You treat people like their effort matters. Like them doing the right thing is worth acknowledging. It makes them want to keep doing it." She thought about that. "My uncle was the same way," she said. "He never made you feel small for working hard. He just treated it like the obvious baseline." She watched the ridge. "I used to think that was just how he was. Later I understood it was a choice he made, every day." "It's a harder choice than it looks," Caleb said. "Yes," she said. "I'm not good at it," he said plainly. "Not self-pity, just honesty. I tend toward—" He paused. "Alone. It's easier. You don't have to calibrate. You're better at it than you think," she said. He glanced at her. "How do you figure Halsey?" she said. "You walked in and talked to a scared man and made him feel like he had a way out instead of cornered. That's calibration." She kept her eyes on the road. "You did it with me too that first day. You asked if I knew what I was doing instead of telling me I didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Ruth used to say I communicated better through what I didn't say," he said. "She said most people talk too much and I talk too little, and somewhere in the middle there was probably a functional human being." Evelyn smiled. "She sounds like she was right about most things." "Almost everything," he said. "It was occasionally irritating." She laughed, real short, genuine. He looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize, the one he got when she laughed unexpectedly, like a man who wasn't used to the sound of it and found it did something to him he hadn't prepared for. They reached her gate. She pulled up and he pulled up, and they sat for a moment. The cabin was dark, but she'd left the lamp inside, and the glow of it came through the window, and it looked in that light like a home. "Today mattered," he said. "It's not over," she said. The territorial review will take time. Briggs will have other moves. Yes, he said. But today mattered anyway. She looked at him. Yes, it did. He reached up and adjusted his hat the way he did when he was about to say something he hadn't quite decided to say yet. I've been thinking, he said. That's a broad category, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. About next season. My east pasture has a drainage problem I've been working around for 5 years. Your uncle's property sits uphill from it, which means the grade from my north pasture affects your drainage pattern, she said, seeing it immediately. If we manage the runoff together, you'd eliminate the problem at the source rather than the output. He looked at her. Yes, exactly. We'd need to survey the grade, she said. See where the slope breaks, probably dig a catch system on my side. I could ride the line with you, he said. Next week if you have time. I'll make time, she said. He nodded, started to turn his horse, stopped. Evelyn, he said. She waited. I'm glad you came, he said. To this valley. To... He gestured slightly vaguely at the surrounding mountains, the road, all of it. Here. It was the most he'd said in that direction. She understood that for him it was a great deal. I'm glad too, she said. More than I expected to be. He held her gaze for a moment in the dark. Then he turned his horse north, then rode for his own spread, and she watched the gray horse disappear up the road until she couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore. She went inside and lit the lamp properly and put the kettle on. Then she sat at her uncle's table and opened her notebook and wrote down everything she remembered about the territorial survey. The location of the water table, the extent of the system, the properties it ran beneath. She wrote it the way her uncle had taught her to write important things, clearly, completely with dates and names and specifics, so that if something happened to her, the record would stand on its own. When she was done, she read it back. Then she wrote at the bottom, "This land is worth fighting for. It always was." She closed the notebook. Outside the window, the ridge had gone dark. Only the stars above it left, and the creek was running soft and steady. Somewhere she couldn't see, and the well she'd found 3 weeks ago was full and clean under its new cover, and the fence line was solid from one end of the property to the other. She had built that. Not alone, not entirely, not anymore. But she had started it alone, and she had held it alone, and she had done enough to earn the help that had come. She sat at the table in her uncle's cabin. Her cabin, and she felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could easily track. At rest. Not finished. Not done. There was still the territorial review, still Briggs's next move, still the water rights and the railroad inquiry, and the season's work ahead. But at rest within herself in the particular way that came not from the absence of struggle, but from knowing you were equal to it. The kettle began to whistle. She got up. And somewhere to the north, 3 miles over the ridge, a light was burning in Caleb Thornton's cabin too. She didn't know that. She couldn't see it. But somehow she thought it anyway. The territorial review took 6 weeks. Evelyn knew this because she counted them not obsessively, not in the way of someone waiting for rescue, but the way you tracked weather patterns and water levels and the slow turn of a season, because time was information, and information was how you stayed ahead. She marked each week in her notebook alongside her yield counts and her water measurements, and the growing list of things she had fixed, built, or improved since the day she stepped off that coach with a tool chest and a dead man's deed. 6 weeks, 42 days. And in those 42 days, Briggs made 3 more moves. The first was the quietest and the most dangerous. He approached the railroad land company directly. She found out through her attorney, who had a contact in Denver, and told them the Harper water rights were under active territorial dispute. It was technically true. The review was active. He used true language to build a false picture, which she had come to understand was his primary skill. The land company predictably put their inquiry on hold. She wired her attorney the same day she found out. He wired back within 12 hours. He had already contacted the land company's legal office with the full documented record, the retraction, the denied petition, the judge's notation about filing abuse, and had requested they make no decisions until the territorial review concluded. They agreed to wait. 1 move neutralized. The second move was public and loud. Briggs called a town meeting in Red Hollow, not a valley landowner meeting this time, but a general town meeting, the kind anyone could attend. He stood up in front of 60 people and gave a speech about water security and community stability and the risks of outside interests coming in to monetize the valley's resources. He didn't name her once. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew which outside interest he meant. She went to the meeting. She sat in the third row. When he was done, she raised her hand, and the sheriff who was chairing recognized her. She stood up and said calmly, "The water table beneath my property has been documented in a territorial survey from 12 years ago. The survey is a public record available at the territorial office. It shows that the water system extends beneath 4 properties in this valley, 3 of which are currently owned by Mr. Briggs." She looked around the room. If Mr. Briggs is concerned about outside interests monetizing our water resources, I'd suggest the town ask him what inquiries he himself has made about that possibility over the past 18 months. The room went still. Briggs's face didn't change, but his hands did a small tightening controlled immediately. She had been watching for it. "That's a serious accusation," he said. "It's a question," she said. "You're welcome to answer it." He didn't answer it. He moved on. But the room had heard the question, and rooms remembered questions even when they didn't get answers. Oakes found her outside afterward and said without preamble, "That was the right thing to say and the right way to say it." "I learned from watching him," she said. "He's very good at using true statements to mislead. It works in the other direction, too." Oakes made a sound that was 3 parts admiration and 1 part relief. "I should have pushed back on him years ago," he said. "I kept thinking someone else would." "Nobody ever does," she said. "Until they do." He shook his head slowly. "Your uncle would have loved to see that," he said. She felt it, a sharp, particular ache of grief that came not from missing someone generally, but from wishing they could see a specific moment. It passed the way it did when you'd learned to let it move through rather than holding it. "I know," she said. "I think he saw it anyway." 2 moves neutralized. 2. The third move was the one she hadn't seen coming, and it came not from Briggs, but from the valley's memory of itself. She was working the east fence line a quarterly check, because that was the discipline she'd built and intended to keep when a wagon came up the north road. Not fast, not aggressive. Just a wagon with 2 people in it, a man and woman about her parents' age, and a boy, maybe 10, sitting in the back with a dog. They pulled up and the man said, "Are you Evelyn Harper?" "I am," she said. "My name is Thomas Coulter," he said. "This is my wife Addie. We had the property that's now Briggs's south pasture, about 8 years back." He paused. "We heard what you've been doing, what you filed, the territorial review." He looked at her steadily. "We still have our original deed, the survey that was done when we bought. And we've got a letter from Briggs's attorney at the time making representations about our water rights that were false. Deliberately false." Evelyn set down her post driver. "You kept the letter," she said. "Addie kept everything," he said. The woman beside him nodded once with the look of someone who had been told her habit of keeping things was excessive and had been proven right in the most significant way possible. "We didn't know what to do with it at the time. We were young. We didn't have an attorney. We were scared and we left." He held her gaze. "We've been living in Cheyenne. When we heard what was happening, we thought maybe it finally matters now." Evelyn looked at him, looked at the woman, looked at the boy in the back with the dog who was watching all of this with the wide eyes of a child who understood something important was happening without knowing exactly what. "Come inside," she said. "I'll put the coffee on." She had her attorney in Red Hollow by the next morning. Pryor read the Coulter letter twice. He looked at Evelyn over the top of his reading glasses with an expression that was, for a man of his professional restraint, fairly close to stunned. "This is a fraudulent misrepresentation of water rights made in the course of a property sale," he said. "It's not just a filing abuse, it's fraud." "How does that change the territorial review?" she said. "It escalates it," he said, "significantly. Fraudulent misrepresentation in property sales is a territorial criminal matter, not just a county civil one. This goes to the territorial attorney's office with a different weight." He set the letter down. "This isn't just your land anymore, Miss Harper. This is a pattern." She had understood that it was a pattern since the night she read the county records. She had hoped someone with the authority to act on it would reach the same conclusion. "How long?" she said. "Faster than 6 weeks," he said. He was right. It took 9 days. On a Tuesday afternoon in late August, with the summer starting its slow lean toward fall, and the ridge showing the first faint traces of yellow in the aspens, a territorial marshal rode into Red Hollow with 2 deputies and a sealed order from the territorial court. She heard about it from the livery boy, the same one who'd brought her the attorney's wire all those weeks ago, who came tearing up her road at a gallop for the second time in her life on this land. "Miss Harper," he said, barely stung. "They've arrested Briggs." She set down her water bucket. "Where?" "At his place, about an hour ago." He was grinning the uncomplicated grin of a 14-year-old who understood power well enough to enjoy seeing it applied correctly. "Garrow told me to tell you, said you'd want to know." She stood in her yard and felt the news settle into her. Not triumph. Not the sharp satisfaction she'd imagined in the early weeks when she was angry and tired and working on determination alone. Something quieter. The feeling of a door closing on a room that had needed closing for a very long time. She went inside and sat at the table and took out her uncle's letter. She didn't read it. She just held it. "It's done," she said. To him, to the cabin, to whatever part of herself still needed to hear it out loud. "It's done, and the land is safe, and you were right about all of it." She sat with that for 10 minutes. Then she put the letter away and went back out to finish checking the water line. Caleb came in the evening. I didn't knock. He hadn't knocked in several weeks, which had happened gradually enough that neither of them had formally acknowledged it. He came around the side of the cabin to where she was at the creek bank and sat on a nearby rock and said, "I heard." "I figured you would," she said. "3 of Briggs's open filings against my property were formally withdrawn this afternoon," he said, "as part of the territorial order." He said it quietly, not dramatically. The way you said something you'd been carrying for 7 years and had finally been able to set down. She straightened up and looked at him. His face was difficult to read, which was standard. But she had spent 4 months learning his face and what she read in it. Now was the particular exhausted relief of a man who had held a position under pressure for so long that he'd stopped noticing the strain of holding it and was only now in the release of it feeling the full weight of what it had been. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he agreed. You never filed a counterclaim, she said. You never pushed back. No, he said. Why? She asked it gently. She already knew the answer mostly, but she thought he needed to say it. He turned his hat in his hands. Because after Ruth, I didn't. I wasn't sure I was going to stay. He looked at the creek. It felt wrong to fight for something I wasn't certain I wanted. He paused. And then the years went by and I stayed, and by then the filings were just part of the landscape, something I worked around. He looked up at her. You don't fight back when you've forgotten you have the right to. She sat on the rock beside him, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. You have the right to, she said. I know that now, he said. He glanced at her sideways. I think I've known it since about the second week of July. When you brought the pipe for the well casing, she said. When you said thank you, like you meant it, and then picked up your shovel, he said. Like the gratitude and the work were the same thing. He looked back at the creek. Ruth used to do that. Move through the world like everything was continuous. Nothing separated. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. I'm not Ruth, she said. Carefully. Because it needed saying, and saying it was a kindness to both of them. I know, he said, immediately, firmly. I know that Evelyn. I'm not... He stopped. Tried again. She's not why I'm here. I'm here because of you. Because of who you are specifically, not who you remind me of. He met her eyes directly. I need you to understand that. She held his gaze. She believed him. She realized believed him for some time. All right, she said. All right, he said. The creek ran between them and the silence, and neither of them broke it for a while, and it was the richest quiet she'd experienced since she came to Wyoming. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "The drainage survey," he said. "On my east pasture. We said we'd ride the line and figure out the catch system." She looked at him. "We did. I've been thinking about it differently," he said. "Not just as a fix for the drainage problem. If we manage the runoff together, your north pasture and my east line, we could improve the water distribution for both properties. Not just fix a problem, build something." He paused. "It would require both of us to be committed to the same plan over multiple seasons." She understood what he was saying. All of it, including the part that wasn't about drainage. "That's a long commitment," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." "You'd have to trust that I'm not going to leave," she said. "That I'm going to be here next season and the season after." "Are you?" he said. She looked at the ridge. The aspens were starting to turn. The creek was running full and clean. The new well was 15 feet deep and producing water at a rate that could sustain twice the operation she currently ran. The fence line was solid. The cabin walls were tight. She had a signed commitment from the railroad land company's attorneys brokered by Pryor after Briggs's arrest, cleared the title dispute to review the water rights formally in the spring with her as the landowner at the table. She had built this. She and the people who had come to stand beside her. She had built it out of grief and stubbornness and her uncle's letters and 9 years of reading contracts in a equipment shop in Missouri and the particular kind of love that looked like showing up every day and doing the work. "I'm not leaving," she said. "This is home. I knew it was home about 3 days after I arrived, and it frightened me because home is something you can lose." She looked at him. "I've decided to stop being frightened of it." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been alone for 4 years, since Ruth. And for the first 2 of those years I told myself it was grief. And for the next 2 I told myself it was preference." He stopped. "It wasn't preference. It was just easier not to want things, easier not to reach." "I know," she said. "I'm reaching now," he said, plainly, directly. The way he said everything important without ornamentation, without performance, just the true weight of it. "I want you to know that." She looked at him in the late summer evening light. At the man who had brought biscuits and pipe fittings and 2 hours of labor when she hadn't asked for any of it, who had sent a boy on a horse to warn her about a meeting she had the right to attend, who had said, "I'm not most men," with such uncomplicated certainty that she'd believed him immediately and found him prove it every day since. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." "And," he said. She leaned slightly toward him, closing the inch of space between their shoulders. He went very still the way he went still when something mattered enough to require all of his attention. "And I'm reaching too," she said. He exhaled slow, steady, like a man who had been holding a position for a long time and had finally been told he could rest. His hand found hers on the rock between them. Not dramatic, not a sweep or a gesture. Just his hand covering hers, the way you placed your hand on something you intended to keep. They sat at the creek until the light was fully gone. The Valley meeting happened the following week. Oakes organized it the way he did everything since Briggs's arrest, with the efficient, slightly overdue energy of a man who had decided to stop letting things slide. 11 Valley landowners came. Real ones, as he'd said, people with working property, people who had been here for years and stayed because the land had gotten into them, people who had been isolated from each other by 30 years of Briggs, making sure they stayed that way. Evelyn came. Caleb came and stood beside her without discussion, because by this point, him standing beside her was simply where he stood. The Coulters came from Cheyenne, Thomas, and Addie, because Oakes had written them a letter asking them to come back and see what the valley looked like now. The boy, their son James, sat next to Caleb and asked him 16 questions about horses in the first 20 minutes, and Caleb answered every one of them with the serious patience of a man who considered no question about horses unworthy of a real answer. Mrs. Holt brought food, because that was what she did, and the meeting happened around a table with real food on it, which changed the quality of the conversation. What got built in that room was not complicated. A water management agreement that gave every landowner equal voice and required full majority for any restriction. A shared equipment schedule for peak seasons. A commitment to share the territorial survey data, so every property in the valley knew what they were sitting on and what it was worth. Nobody chaired it. That was the point. When Oakes tried to run it, Evelyn said, "Let's try it without a chair." And Oakes thought about it for 3 seconds and said, "Fair enough." And it worked better without one. At the end of it, Thomas Coulter said he was thinking about whether there was land in the valley he might buy and bring his family back. He said it to the room, and the room said he'd be welcome. And Addie Coulter cried quietly in the way of a woman who had been told she had to leave somewhere she loved and was now being told she could come back. And nobody made it awkward, because these were people who understood what land and belonging meant. On the ride home, Caleb said, "Your uncle wanted this." "Yes," she said. "He wrote about it." "Not directly," she said. "But in every letter he talked about the valley like it was something that used to be alive and had gone quiet. He talked about the neighbors who were gone, the spring brandings, the way things worked when there were enough people who gave a damn about the same piece of ground." She watched the road ahead. "I think he knew he couldn't fix it himself. He was one man 70 years old at the end." She paused. "I think he hoped someone would come after him and try." "Howe was right," Caleb said. "He usually was," she said. "It was occasionally irritating." He laughed real short, the laugh she had come to love the way you loved rare things, for how little they were rationed. She looked at him laughing, and felt something so full and complete that it had no adequate name. Not happiness exactly, something older and more substantial. The feeling of having arrived somewhere you had been heading without knowing it. Of having become through difficulty and labor and grief and stubbornness, the person you were capable of being. The first frost came on the 14th of September. She woke to it, the particular quality of silence that cold made. The way the cabin felt different, the animals shifting in the lean-to. She put on her coat and went to check the well, because it was the first frost and the casing had to be confirmed. And when she came back inside, she put the coffee on and stood at the window and watched the valley come up white and still in the early light. She heard a horse at 7. She knew the sound of it. He knocked this time. She noticed. She opened the door. He was holding a wrapped bundle cloth around something that smelled like food. He said, "I was up early." "So was I," she said. She stepped back, and he came inside and set the bundle on the table, and she poured 2 cups of coffee without asking, because she knew how he took it, and he sat down at the table, and she sat across from him. And it was, she thought, the most ordinary morning she could imagine. Which was extraordinary? Which was the thing? "First frost," he said. "I checked the well," she said. "Casing held." "Good depth," he said. "I told you," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Past the neighborhood. All the way to where it was going. He reached inside his coat and put something on the table between the 2 cups. It was a folded paper. She looked at him before she opened it. "Open it," he said. She unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map, his property, and hers, marked in his spare, precise handwriting, with the drainage lines sketched between them and the proposed catch system, marked with elevation notes. She understood immediately, because they were her calculations, the ones she'd written down weeks ago and shared with him. At the bottom, in the same spare handwriting, he'd written, "For the long plan." She looked at the map for a moment. Then she looked at him. "This is a serious document," she said. "Yes," he said. "You drew this last night." "Last week," he said. "I've been waiting for the right morning." She felt it, the warmth, the realness of it, the way he showed everything through what he built and planned and prepared the same way she did. 2 people who said the important things with their hands rather than their mouths, learning to say them to each other. "It's a good plan," she said. "I think so," he said. "I have some adjustments," she said. "I expected that," he said. She pulled the map toward her and took out her pencil and began to mark it, and he leaned forward to see, and for a while they talked about nothing but water and grade and soil drainage and season timing. Which was to say, they talked about the future specifically and in detail, which was to say, they talked about everything. Pryor wired in October with the news that the Territorial Attorney's Office had filed formal charges against Briggs on 4 counts of fraudulent misrepresentation in property transactions and 2 counts of filing abuse. The trial was set for spring. She read the wire at the table, filed it in the growing folder she kept for the matter, and went back to the winter preparation she'd been in the middle of. Later, she wrote to her mother. It was the longest letter she'd written since she arrived. She told her about the well and the frost, and the valley meeting, and Oakes and Mrs. Holt, and the Coulters coming back. She described the ridge in October, which was, she said, the most beautiful thing she'd seen in her life, and she was including the Missouri River at sunset, and the view from their old back porch on the 4th of July. She said, "I know you worried. I know you thought I was making a catastrophic mistake. I want you to tell Robert that it wasn't. I want you to tell him specifically that I fixed the well myself." She paused, and then she wrote, "I also want to tell you that I am not alone. I have neighbors now, real ones. And I have someone. You'll want to know the details, and I will tell them to you in the next letter. But for now, I'll say he is a good man. He works hard. He is honest. He is patient in ways I am not, and stubborn in ways I am. And he makes very good biscuits, which I realize is a specific detail, but it matters in the mornings." She sealed the letter. She put on her coat and walked out to the east fence line to do her evening check, because that was what she did, because the habit of attention was what kept the land, because her uncle had taught her through his letters, through the land he'd left her, through the 30 years of quiet example she'd been absorbing without knowing it, that the things worth having were the things you tended every day without being asked. The ridge was going dark. The frost from the morning had burned off in the afternoon sun and come back again as the temperature dropped and the grass under her boots crunched with it. She walked the south corner. The posts were solid. The wire was tight. The gate swung true. She stood at the end of the fence line and looked north toward the ridge, toward the road that went over it, toward the far side, where a light would be burning in a cabin 3 miles away. She thought about everything it had taken to get here. The coach ride and the land clerk's laugh. The well she'd found, and the fence she'd built, and the meeting she'd walked into without being invited, and the petition she'd filed, and the ride to the county seat, and the territorial review, and all of it. The whole accumulated weight of it every day of fighting for the right to stay on land that was already hers. She thought about what she'd learned from all of it, which was not that the world was fair, because it wasn't, or that things worked out because they didn't always, but that a person who paid attention and kept records and showed up every day and refused to be moved could make something real in the world. Could take a broken cabin and a dry well and a dead man's trust and build from it something that mattered, something that held. The mountains had been hard on her. Her uncle had been right about that too. But they had been fair. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, and the lamp was on inside, and she had work to do before morning, and the coffee was on, and there was a letter to finish, and a plan on the table, with her pencil marks on it next to his, and the well was full, and the fence was sound, and the land was hers. She went inside. She sat at the table. She picked up her pencil. Some people came to the mountains, and the mountains broke them. Some people left before the breaking. And some the ones who had come, not because it was easy, but because it was theirs, because they had looked at the hardest possible version of the life they wanted and said yes. That one. I'll take that one. Some people stayed and dug in and built something the mountains themselves had to respect. Evelyn Harper had arrived in Red Hollow, Wyoming, with a worn satchel, a wooden tool chest, and one dead man's faith in her. She had done the rest herself, and that in the end was the only story